who are the characters behind science? This is Science Behind the Glass, illuminating the human side.
In this podcast, we unveil the human side of laboratories and science. Scientists share personal experiences and will discuss their meanings from different perspectives and fields of research.
Disclaimer: this is a translated version using AI voice for the guest. Welcome to Science Behind the Glass, the podcast that explores the people behind the science and the diverse ecosystems they study. Today, we embark on an underwater journey to one of our planet's most fragile and spectacular treasures, coral reefs. These ecosystems not only host incredible biodiversity, but also serve as a haven for marine life, a barrier against the storms, a vital source of sustenance for millions of people worldwide.
However, coral reefs are under constant threat for climate change, pollution, and disease. To discuss groundbreaking research in these ecosystems, we are delighted to welcome Dr. Valeria Pizarro, a marine biologist who has dedicated her career to protect and restore coral reefs, with a particular focus on the Caribbean reefs.
Dr. Pizarro is currently a principal investigator at the Perry Institute for Marine Science, an organization at the forefront of ocean conservation. He leads pioneer reef restoration initiatives in the Caribbean, working to revive degraded corals and make them more resilient to an uncertain future. Additionally, Dr. Pizarro is a tireless advocate for education and community engagement, raising awareness about the importance of coral reefs and the impact their degradation has on the human populations that depend on them. It's a pleasure to have you with us, Valeria. Welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and especially for that introduction.
To start, could you explain in broad terms what coral reefs are and what threats they face?
Coral reefs are the coastal marine ecosystems with the highest biodiversity. Here, I'm specifically referring to shallow coral reefs, which are located in the tropical regions of oceans and seas. These ecosystems are crucial due to their biodiversity, which is why they're often called the tropical rainforests of the seas, as they house about 25% of the world's marine biodiversity. This alone makes them vital for maintaining and supporting life. But they go beyond that. They cover a very small area, about 1% of the marine environment, which is less than 0.1% of the Earth's surface. Despite their limited area, they harbor immense biodiversity and provide countless ecosystem services that benefit humans and other species. These benefits include coastal protection. For instance, during hurricane season, healthy coral reefs can reduce wave impacts, offering better protection for human life and property. They also contribute to tourism, forming beautiful white sand beaches in places like the Riviera Maya in Mexico or the Bahamas. Additionally, coral reefs are essential for food security. Globally, 25% of seafood, including fish and crustaceans like lobsters, comes from reef ecosystems. This biomass is further supported by neighboring ecosystems such as seagrass beds and mangroves. Their importance goes far beyond their beauty.
And what threats are these ecosystems currently facing?
The threats are enormous. Those of us who work in conservation often categorize them into different scales. On a global scale, climate change is one of the most prominent issues, affecting not just temperature but also causing ocean acidification. This happens because the excessive CO2 emissions saturate the ocean, altering its chemistry and weakening organisms like corals, mollusks, and snails that rely on calcium carbonate skeletons. We also see an increase in severe and frequent storms, pollution, microplastics, and chemical runoff from agriculture. On a local scale, unsustainable coastal development, overfishing, and destructive practices like dynamite fishing continue to wreak havoc. These threats combine to create immense challenges for coral reefs.
With such challenges, what inspired you to study coral reefs and dedicate yourself to this field?
When I started, I didn't know all these things. I initially studied terrestrial ecosystems and thought I might focus on primates or mammals. It wasn't until I took a diving course near the end of my undergraduate studies that I felt drawn to the ocean. I knew little about corals, but I decided to pursue a master's degree in marine ecosystems. During that time, I fell in love with corals, and the more I learned, the more fascinating they became. From then on, I stayed committed to this field.
You have done extensive work on reef restoration, particularly in the Caribbean. What are the challenges of restoring such a fragile ecosystem?
The challenges are numerous and have evolved over time. For instance, pathogens have spread rapidly in the semi-enclosed Caribbean Sea, devastating coral populations. Restoration efforts began by propagating coral fragments in nurseries. These corals grow well in nurseries, but survival rates can vary when transplanted to reefs. Unfortunately, recent heat waves have caused massive bleaching events, undoing years of restoration work. For example, in the Bahamas, we worked on a project for 15 years where the corals were thriving. Unfortunately, we lost everything, all the corals died. This happened because corals have a symbiotic relationship with algae, which helps them survive in nutrient-poor environments. However, when temperatures rise, these algae produce toxins, leading to coral bleaching. If temperatures don't drop, the coral can't get enough nutrients to sustain this symbiosis, and it ultimately dies. Although corals are excellent at living in harmony with these algae under normal conditions, their survival depends on temperatures staying within certain limits. This thermal stress phenomenon not only affected our project but was observed across the Caribbean, with devastating consequences for marine ecosystems in the region. We had been making progress in restoring branching corals, which was very encouraging. However, we faced a new challenge. Rising temperatures not only caused coral bleaching but also led to the emergence of new diseases affecting massive coral species. We have dealt with many diseases, including black band, yellow band, white plague, which has 3 variants, and dark spot disease. All these have severely impacted coral populations. However, there is one disease in particular that stands out. It appeared in Florida in 2014 and has a terrible name: stony coral tissue loss disease, SCTLD. This disease is the deadliest ever recorded for massive corals, affecting 34 species. In the Caribbean, we unfortunately don't have as many coral species as the Indo-Pacific, which has around 800 species. Here, we have about 80, of which only 40 or 50 are useful for restoration. This means that when a disease affects 34 species, our options are running out. That's why we are focusing on finding resilient and resistant colonies to begin restoration, as we're losing corals at an alarming rate. We've developed techniques like microfragmentation, which takes advantage of the fact that corals are clonal. When corals are large, they can reproduce sexually very well. But when they're small, they lose this ability. By cutting them into small fragments, it's like rejuvenating them, although not literally, their biology changes. They can no longer reproduce sexually due to their small size, but they grow much faster. This technique allows us to group fragments from the same initial colony and accelerate their growth. What would normally take 10 years can now be achieved in just 2, speeding up the restoration process. Another technique we use in restoration involves collecting gametes during the synchronized spawning of many coral species. This allows us to raise baby corals with much greater genetic diversity compared to using coral nurseries. These techniques weren't invented by me, but we implement them in collaboration with many experts who have dedicated significant time and effort to developing them.
I have a question. With all this effort to research and address problems, especially as a new diseases constantly emerge, what policies are being implemented globally to reduce the impacts on coral reefs? It seems like much of the work is focused on patching up the consequences rather than addressing the root cause, like pollution and climate change.
Each country has its own governance system. For example, Colombia has some of the best environmental regulations in the world, on paper. The problem is that these regulations often remain just that, words on paper. One reason is the limited resources available. Tropical countries, which host the most biodiverse ecosystems, often lack the political and economic power to enforce these policies effectively. Other countries, like Mexico, have made significant progress in protecting reefs. For instance, Mexico spans the entire Mesoamerican barrier reef and has various organizations working to develop reef conservation policies. One of their most notable initiatives was the creation of the world's first reef insurance policy. This policy ensures funds are available for reef rescue and restoration in the event of hurricanes or other disasters, setting a precedent that other regions are beginning to replicate. For example, similar initiatives are being explored in the Bahamas, where discussions are underway about implementing reef insurance for environmental disasters. A significant challenge is determining who should bear the cost of such insurance. This inevitably involves holding industries responsible for the global impacts of climate change accountable, as this problem cannot be addressed solely on a regional scale. This issue was discussed at COP16 a few weeks ago. It was one of the first times that marine ecosystems, including coral reefs, were a central focus in international agreements. Progress has been slow, but steps are being taken. Initiatives like the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration have brought increased attention and resources to regions like Colombia, Mexico, and the Caribbean. For example, we have a project funded by CORDAP with $1.5 million allocated among 5 organizations, primarily to develop probiotics for coral health. While it's a significant sum, it's still not enough for all that needs to be done.
That's impressive. Here in Australia, there are many programs addressing these issues, but it's also one of the world's largest coal exporters. The proximity of the Grand Barrier Reef to coal exporting ports is quite controversial, as you mentioned earlier. In your daily work, you interact with coastal communities. Could you share your impressions of how these communities have responded to the challenges of coastal living and marine conservation?
My projects currently have a limited impact, but I hope they will grow over time. Working with communities varies greatly depending on their characteristics and needs. Some vulnerable communities notice environmental changes, but understanding them fully is harder when they're focused on meeting daily needs. For example, when we discuss overfishing and the need to limit it, fishermen often respond, "But how do we support our families?" This highlights a common shortcoming among researchers, myself included. We often fail to integrate communities into conservation actions effectively. It's not easy, as they require resources. It's crucial to design projects that genuinely involve communities and allow them to take ownership of the processes. I must admit that I haven't been completely successful with these approaches. Often, resources are limited, and when a project ends, there is no continuity or presence in the community, which becomes a problem. I've been rethinking how to design projects where the community can take ownership and continue independently, so I can step away knowing the work will go on. For most of these communities, the degradation of reefs and ecosystems is very evident. They might not fully understand what's happening with the coral reef specifically, but they see and feel the deterioration. They've lived through it. At the same time, they've often been ignored because we assume they lack sufficient knowledge. I believe this is one of our biggest mistakes. Traditional knowledge must be listened to. Sitting down with communities and asking, "What was this area like before?" or "What used to happen here?" can provide invaluable insights. For example, in the Bahamas, while some people face economic difficulties, fishermen are not among the most disadvantaged. In Colombia, however, artisanal fishers often experience significant financial struggles. This shows the importance of analyzing the context of each community to determine how they can be involved in projects. Although progress has been made, and some projects in the Caribbean have improved the relationship between researchers and communities, we're still far from where we should be. I hope that future generations, with a more focused education on these aspects, will bring change. If communities truly take ownership of these projects, it will not only transform the way they are carried out, but also increase their success rates.
That's key. Recently, we had Professor Sean Olm as guest. He's an archaeologist with over 25 years of experience working with indigenous communities in Australia. He explained that his approach is to work directly with communities, allowing them to design the methodologies and actively participating in their research. However, he emphasized that this process cannot be standardized because each community has unique needs and context. This ties into what you have mentioned. As scientists, we have often failed to establish meaningful connections with the communities. While progress has been made in some areas, much remains to be done. It's crucial to ensure that projects aren't just implemented and abandoned, but have continuity and long-term funding to create a lasting impact.
Exactly. As scientists, we often work with funding that lasts only 1 or 2 years, yet the processes we're tackling, such as restoration or conservation, require decades. This forces us to rethink how we structure our projects and seek more sustainable partnerships. A key solution is fostering public-private partnerships, which can provide resources and long-term stability. Additionally, interdisciplinary collaborations are essential. Partnering with economists, administrators, and other specialists can offer insights in areas where we, as scientists, lack expertise. This complementarity can help us design more comprehensive and sustainable projects over time.
Returning to the scientific aspect of reef work, you mentioned the diseases affecting corals in the Caribbean. One that stands out is stony coral tissue loss disease. Could you tell us more about how this disease is being monitored and the novel methods like probiotics being explored to combat these pathogens?
Stony coral tissue loss disease is, quite literally, my worst nightmare, and the one I'm dealing with the most right now. It appeared in Florida in 2014 and has since spread throughout the Caribbean. As I mentioned, the Caribbean Sea has a long water residence time, so when something starts in Florida, it takes longer to reach us, thanks to the strong current between Florida and Cuba. However, it always gets here eventually, just like the lionfish, which also started in Florida, took years to spread, but ultimately arrived. It's the same with this disease. We don't yet know exactly what pathogen causes it. The best studies suggest it might be a virus that affects the symbiotic algae zooxanthellae, leading to secondary bacterial infections. We know bacteria are involved because, when the disease first appeared, researchers in Florida began experimenting with different approaches, including antibiotics. We discovered that amoxicillin is effective in treating the disease. Corals are clonal organisms. A large coral is composed of thousands or even millions of polyps. These polyps can die off in sections, just as corals can be fragmented and propagated. The disease spreads slowly, killing parts of the coral over time, but applying amoxicillin can stop its progression. The issue with this disease, and coral diseases in general, is the devastating impact they have. For example, white band disease wiped out 95% of branching corals. Stony coral tissue loss disease is even more lethal, as it affects the majority of reef-building corals. It spreads rapidly when it reaches a reef, infects many species, and can kill corals that took decades to grow in just a month. The mortality rate is staggering, and the coral community of an affected site changes drastically. I've worked in 2 specific locations: the Bahamas, where the disease arrived in 2019, and the archipelago of San Andres, Providencia, and Santa Catalina in Colombia, where it appeared at the end of 2022. What I've been doing is monitoring the spread of the disease, how it reaches different areas, how it progresses across reef zones, and how it impacts coral communities. I've also been observing changes in the structure of the coral reefs and applying antibiotics in prioritized areas to try to save as many corals as possible. To clarify, I'm aware that applying antibiotics is highly controversial. We know that using antibiotics isn't the best solution. It can lead to the development of super-resistant bacteria and other issues. I'm fully conscious of this, but seeing corals die at this rate, and knowing this is something I can do to help right now, I will do it. When we use antibiotics in our daily lives, much of it ends up in the ocean through wastewater anyway. The amount of antibiotics already present in the environment is significant, not because of these targeted treatments, but because of general human activity. Still, I acknowledge that antibiotics aren't an ideal solution. That's why we're now working on a major project through CORDAP to develop probiotics that can be applied in the same way as antibiotics to halt the disease. Probiotics may offer additional benefits, such as boosting the coral's immune system, which, while not as complex as ours, can help them build resilience. We're also testing whether probiotics can promote faster growth or enhance reproductive success, such as producing more eggs and sperm. Additionally, we want to study whether probiotics can improve the survival rates of new coral recruits, those small, young corals. However, one challenge is that probiotics are specific to each region. For example, I can develop probiotics for corals in San Andres, but I can't take those and apply them in the Bahamas. Some people suggest using probiotics developed in Florida that have shown success there, but the populations aren't connected, so it wouldn't work. That specificity makes this process more complicated.
Wow, that sounds incredible and like a lot of work.
Yes, for example, in the Red Sea and at King Abdullah University, they've started using probiotics to combat thermal stress. They've created a bacterial set for their corals, and it seems to be working, but as you said, it's only applicable to that region's corals.
Exactly. I reviewed an article recently that I believe has now been published, which tests probiotics for heat stress, essentially increasing the coral's temperature tolerance. It is good to hear there's hope. You work at the intersection of science and direct conservation actions to protect corals. How do you balance the frustration of all these threats, knowing the risk of coral extinction, with the hope that science and technology bring?
I don't know if I balance it well. Sometimes I cry, but the reality is that something must be done. There are two options. You can either say, there's nothing more to do, and give up. That's a valid option. I'm not overly optimistic, I don't think. I'm going to save the world, or that my work will fix everything. But I also don't think doing nothing is an option. For me, that's what drives me forward. For instance, this year while I was in the Bahamas, coral bleaching started unusually early in July. Most corals were already bleached and beginning to die. I was on an expedition with my boss, the director of the Perry Institute, and I asked him, "What are we going to do? I've spent my whole life studying corals, and now I'm watching them die." At one point, I even thought, should I switch to studying sponges instead? But it's too late for that. It was a very tough moment. I think 2023 has been particularly challenging for many researchers in the Caribbean. On top of everything else, those of us working on sexual reproduction in corals faced a terrible year. Many corals didn't reproduce. This is bad news for both the corals and for us. But even so, I'm not going to stop. My influence might be small, but if I can make even a tiny contribution, I will. This podcast, for example, allows people to learn about corals and think, okay, I can do something even if it's small. It's a difficult balance. When I visit reefs, I often recognize specific coral colonies I've worked with before. Seeing that some have recovered and are still alive is encouraging. Of course, others relapse, but those small victories matter. Encounters with turtles or sharks are also moments of joy that keep me going. One thing I've learned in the Caribbean is that while species compositions may appear similar across locations, each community is unique. Recognizing these differences helps in making better decisions. Not everything that works in one place will work in another. Having the ability to adapt to the specific needs, conditions, and opportunities of each site is vital. This adaptability is essential not only in research, but in life as well. It's about not seeing everything in black and white, but instead being open to adjusting and learning. This adaptability becomes a life skill, making it easier to understand what went wrong in one context and how to approach things differently in another.
From your personal scientific and emotional perspective, what role do ordinary people, even those who don't live near the ocean, play in protecting coral reefs and ocean? How can we as individuals help mitigate this catastrophe?
I've always believed that if people know about something, they are more likely to protect it. So, for those who aren't scientists or don't live near the sea, understanding corals, reefs, and coastal ecosystems can help them realize how small actions can significantly contribute to their preservation. If someone can support organizations like NGOs, whether by donating or participating in their programs, that's fantastic. If you're a diver, you can ask local dive centers whether they collaborate on reef restoration, organize beach cleanups, or run coral nurseries. But even without financial resources, there are ways to help. Simply talking about corals and reefs with family and friends can make a difference. We must recognize that everything we do, even if we live in the middle of a continent, affects the ocean. The boundaries we draw between terrestrial and marine environments are artificial. In reality, everything is interconnected. Raising awareness about this interconnectedness and spreading knowledge is incredibly important. Campaigns have already made progress. For instance, using reusable water bottles and reducing plastic waste has become more common. While we still need greater scale, there's been growth in these practices. I think the next step is for everyone to understand what a coral is, why it matters, and how it connects to the larger ecosystem. For example, most children around the world can recognize an elephant or a giraffe. Wouldn't it be amazing if they could also identify a coral? They could understand that thanks to corals, we have sharks, and thanks to sharks, we have corals. It's all connected. It's also essential to be conscious of the products we use. For instance, sunscreen can directly or indirectly harm reefs. I try to buy reef-safe sunscreens when I snorkel, although it's hard to be sure if they're genuinely safe. I often avoid using sunscreen altogether by covering up as much as possible with dive suits and other clothing, but this is a challenging balance since we've been taught to protect our skin with sunscreen. Not all sunscreens labeled as reef-safe truly are. It's often difficult to verify their claims, and we have to trust what the labels say. Ideally, regulatory bodies would ensure these claims are accurate.
Valeria, thank you so much for joining us today, for sharing your knowledge, experiences, frustrations, and challenges you face, as well as for giving us hope and inspiration to continue working toward a better future for coral reefs. These ecosystems so large they can't be seen from space truly deserve all our efforts.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to talk about corals. It's definitely one of the advantages of my work.
This episode was inspired by the remarkable biodiversity of coral reefs and the urgent need to tackle the challenges threatening their survival. We hope it has sparkled your curiosity and motivated you to be part of the solution. Remember, this podcast is self-funded and lovingly edited by your dedicated host. Stay connected with us through our social media platforms, Instagram, X, Facebook, LinkedIn, and visit our official website for updates and more inspiring stories. Don't forget to subscribe and share this podcast with your friends and colleagues to help spread these incredible narratives. If you'd like to support our mission, we invite you to make a donation via PayPal. Simply click the donate button on our website. Your support is vital to keep this project alive and thriving. Until next time, keep exploring, stay curious, and always seek the human side behind every discovery. Thank you for being part of our journey.